So, good morning, everyone. So, for those who don't know me, I'm Joran Rolland, and I'm from Lille in France. And I'm going to talk to you about fast sampling, and if I have some time, resampling of rare events in turbulent geophysical flows. And I will start this presentation by showing you some examples of the, let's say, fluid flows that I study for this, where I found these multi-stability events. The first kind of this flow is the case of 2D turbulence, so in a plane, where you add differential rotation, so in a so-called beta plane. So you have the beta parameter that controls this, and it's 2D turbulence. You inject energy at small scales, and one way or another, it's transported to large scales. And in the zonal direction, so in that direction x, well, there is no bound to the scales where the energy can be transported. But in the meridional direction, the beta parameters introduces what is called the Rhine scales, which scales like 1/√, of beta. That's such a limit to the meridional scale to which energy can be transported. And that leads to the formation of what is called zonal jets. So here this is visualized in these two pictures with color levels of the vertical vorticity. And from this, you can reconstruct the zonal velocity. And what happens is that as you vary beta, you're going to end up with basically a region of bistability where you can have several jet size which are allowed, which is illustrated by these two color levels. And actually, when you simulate the flow and let it evolve, you will have a jump from this, for instance, 2-jet state to this three-jet state. So you have this kind of bistable behavior for 2D turbulence, and this has been proposed as a model for, let's say, the Jovian jets, if you neglect any depth effects. So that's the first example. Second example I'm going to talk about, and in which I've been interested in for many years, is the case of, well, for stably simplified boundary layers, they have a discontinuous transition to turbulence, and it can be modeled by very canonical flows like plane quad flows or flows like that. So I work a lot on basically the simplest case, at least numerically, the plane quad flow, which is sketched here. So basically the flow between two parallel moving plates, which basically is controlled by its Reynolds number and the size. And what happens in plane quad flow is that the laminar base flow is linearly stable for all Reynolds number. So this means that, but turbulence exists, as you can see in these numerical simulations, where you see the kinetic energy in a horizontal plane. So what happens is that you have multi-stability between turbulent flow and laminar flow. So what this means is that if you put some forcing or some finite amplitude initial condition in plane quad flow, it can go toward turbulence. And meanwhile, you can have also that the natural collapse of wall turbulence toward the laminar flow after a certain time. So you have this bistability within laminar and turbulent flow. And this bistability can also, well, this coexistence of laminar and turbulent flow, illustrated in the picture in the middle here, can also exist in space. So you can have in the flow regions where the flow is laminar in black and where it is turbulent. So that's a second example I'm going to talk about a bit more later. And a third example, which is more like fluid dynamics problem, but yes. So the case of tilted jets. So when you you can have a tilted jet which responds left or right, which is flanked by two counter-rotating vortices. So you can see here the jet pointing right here, left here in the simulation pointing left. So in that case, the way I generate this jet that can be bistable left or right actually is not by some let's say geophysical effects like rotation, but by having a flow arriving on two rods, and then the flow that passes between two rods can then point left or right. And what it is interesting with this configuration for the left or right pointing jet is that I can, well, simulate it with a Run's equation to have the steady states, or even ADS or direct numerical simulations. But what is also interesting is that I can do, let's say, laboratory experiments where I generate these jets and then basically measure what happens with particle image velocimetry. So I can have both simulations and experimental data in the lab for this configuration. This is what has interested me in this tilted jet problem. And so you have all these flow which are bistable, and it's actually central to their behavior. But one difficulty when you want to study bistability, which I illustrate here again with the zonal jet problem. So, well, as I said, you have the 3 jet states and the 2 jet states for some values of the beta parameter. And you can see, well, the evolution here in this spatial temporal diagram, where you have basically the flow, the vertical vorticity averaged along the zonal direction. And you see, well, you have 2 jet states here, you jump to 3, 2, 3. And well, this simulation took at least a month and with parallelization to run. So it's a bit expensive. And then you can look at the time scales. Well, in this plot here, where you have as a function of time, the amplitude of Fourier mode 2, 0 and 3, 0, which measure basically the amplitude of the 3 jet or the 2 mode jet, 2 jet states. And you can see that you go from, let's say, 2 jets to 3 jets to 2 jets when either of the Fourier coefficients is large or small. And in this time series, you can identify 3 time scales that you will have to resolve. The smallest time scales basically is the turnover time of the smallest eddies here, which is the smallest time scale of the problem that you will have to take to include in your simulation. So you cannot have a DT which is larger than that. So otherwise it's going to be a nonsense. Then the slightly larger time scale is here in orange is the duration of a reversal. So you have to resolve this also in a simulation. So fine, you can maybe have a small time step and have something which is stable. But then you also have to resolve the waiting time between 2 switches here in blue, which is actually very large compared to the last 2. So if you want to do direct numerical simulations, well, you have to basically capture this 3 time scale. You have to capture a very large range of time scales, and that makes this kind of numerical simulation very difficult to do and very very expensive. Meanwhile, in experiments, well, if you you are also constrained to, for instance, if you want to measure several switches, to have an experiment which is long enough to have this time here. So you can have a very long experiment, but then a very crude time resolution. So you miss also the detail of these events. So in both cases, you have this limitation of a very large range of time scales when you study multi-stability, when it becomes rare, which makes the problem difficult. So how can we bypass this? So I, with collaborators, spent a lot of time working on the relevant simulation methods. So before I introduce this, I will make a short sketch of basically what we study. So we make this kind of representation, let's say in phase space or in a reduced order space, where you have maybe one blob where you have the first metastable states, another blob where you have the second metastable state. So here you can, for instance, have 3 jets or 2 jets, or turbulence or laminar, or jet left, jet right. And what happens when you let the flow evolve and represent its evolution in time? So you have this kind of curve where the flow basically has excursion around and out of this first metastable state. And after some time, we'll have a largest excursion and join the second metastable state and then fluctuate inside. So this trajectory, which starts in the first metastable state, has excursions and then moves to these second state, is called the first passage trajectory. And its average duration is called the mean first passage time, and its inverse is the transition rate. And you also have this last bit highlighted in red, which is called the reactive trajectory. So this is really the part of the realization of the dynamics where you go from one state to the other. And when you want to study how you have these transitions, capturing the reactive trajectories and what happens during the reactive trajectories is very interesting to understand what goes on. And well, you have this behavior, as I said, in turbulent flows for the turbulence or for the wall turbulence, etc. And what is also interesting to us is that this kind of bistability problems have been widely studied in kinetic chemistry for almost a century. So basically, they had a lot of ideas, and we took some of these ideas to help us simulate our multi-stable flow. So one thing I've used extensively are relevant simulation methods. So there are many different relevant simulation methods, And one method I've used is called adaptive multi-level splitting, so summarized at AMS. So it's a cloning algorithm. So it's a method to simulate very rapidly, let's say, the reactive trajectories and the mean first passage time. So how does it work? Well, what you do is that you have several clone versions of your flow, so which will have its time evolution. So several clone versions, for instance, of the barometric flow, so that the 2D flow with the differential rotations. And what you do with this is that you're going to apply a mutation selection procedure to these clones. So again, I represent it in this sketch. So for instance, here I sketched in the sketch there are few clones, 3. So you're going to be able to, on each of this flow to measure how far they went from relatively to the departure state and the arrival state with what is called a reaction coordinate or a score function or an observable. So it's a function or maybe a phase space to 0, 1, which basically measures how far you went. So it's an important function. And with this, you measure on the trajectories the largest value of phi. You order the clones, and you remove the one which had the smallest excursion. And then you rebranch on another. And you do this iteratively to generate, in the end, n clone trajectories that go from A to B. And the advantage of that is that, well, while the cost of the direct numerical simulations to generate n, let's say, realization that display a switch is basically going to go like n times t and grow very rapidly. The advantage of AMS is that it requires, let's say, a number of k of iterations, and k scales like the log of t. So in the end, the numerical cost is going to be like n times the log of t. And when t grows exponentially, n times the log of t is going to grow linearly. So it's going to be much cheaper. So it's actually very interesting. And now I'm going to show several examples where we applied successively this kind of method. So first, with Eric Simonet, we worked on the 2-jet, 3-jet problem and applied AMS to compute the transition from 2 jets to 3 jets and from 3 jets to 2 jets, measuring the waiting time before you had a transition, and then observe what happens in the jets when you went from a given number to the other. And with AMS, it was possible to sample a lot of trajectories at a much lower numerical cost. So what you can do, for instance, is visualize the trajectories in a reduced order space here with the amplitude of the Fourier mode. And you can then have these tubes which contain, let's say, 80% of the trajectories that went from 2 to 3 and from 3 to 2. So you can see that's actually that you follow different paths from the 2 jets to 3 jets and from 3 jets to 2 jets, which is a mark of, let's say, out of equilibrium problem. So you can also examine what happens when you change the number of jets and why how, let's say, in the tail of the flow field, the paths are different. So when you go from 2 to 3 jets, you actually have an eastward jet appearing at the tip of the westward jet. And when you go from 3 to 2, well, it's a different chance. You have 2 eastward jets that merge. So that's, you can then follow this and then extend this to more complex cases. So this was a first successful application of these methods to actually a very complex system. Another application of these methods to an even more complex systems, where basically we do not have any stochastic forcing. So where basically we have to wait for the deterministic collapse of turbulence is the case of the collapse of turbulence in a wall flow. So there I had to make some modifications to AMS to apply it to a deterministic system, but nevertheless, I could compute the mean waiting time and the trajectories before you go from a fully turbulent wall flow to a laminar wall flow. So here you illustrated in this reactive trajectory where you see the kinetic energy decreasing. And this was then it was possible to study what happens when turbulent collapses with here the streamwise velocity, and here it's a spanwise velocity, which is a proxy for the streamwise vorticity. And basically what I could see, that's turbulent collapsed locally by creating these kind of holes, which are streamwise elongated, where basically you have no more streamwise vorticity. And that's in this creation of holes, you have this 2-step process. So where you've killed first the vortices, and then this structure called the velocity strict decayed more slowly. So you have this 2-stage process that I could study here and then compute mean waiting time. And it was actually consistent with a previous analytical and numerical work that I had done in models of world flows. So I apply techniques of large deviations and using timescale separation and all these things to study the mechanism of turbulence collapse in models. And basically, I had a similar behavior of first killing the vortices, then what is called these velocity streaks. And yeah, and so that's, I don't know how much I have left.
Oh, plenty of time. So I have still 10 minutes.
Okay. So now I talked mostly about the use of the relevant simulation method. So now I'm going to spend some time talking about how to construct effective models and try to see if you can reuse these models to help the sampling of rare events. So basically, what do you want to do? So let's say you have some experiments in the lab or direct numerical simulations where you have observed a handful of switches. So here you have some time series coming from the tilting jet problem. So with the weighted Y position of the jet, and you can see that we sampled in experiments several switches. So the jet goes left, right, left, right, left, right, and you have sampled this. You have a few switches, and you would like from this to try to identify let's say a model, maybe a Markov chain or a stochastic process that you could then use to analyze or to resample or to use to help relevant simulation methods. So what you want to do is either construct this Markov chain, so with the transition matrix, or if you want to identify a stochastic process, have a drift and a diffusion. So what will be important if you want to reuse this model is that if you have, let's say, a handful of switches, you will need to be able to identify precisely these two functions from this handful of switches, and then you reuse them to calculate analytically or to resample to estimate the mean first passage time. So that's to hope that's to be able to compute F and A precisely for only a handful of trajectory, and also have a simple expression for F and A to reuse them later and try to analyze it. So one first thing that can be done is the identifications of Markov chains from the data. So one way to do this is to transport what is called the analog methods to construct to make forecasts, to construct these Markov chains, basically from some time series labeled by their instance. Then you will identify basically where a new point can transit from what you had recorded before. And to put it simply, you find its k nearest neighbors, and basically it has a property 1 over k, if there are no bias in the sample, to have the transition of one of its k nearest neighbors. And from the time series, you generate a transition matrix. So from this transition matrix, you can regenerate new time series, and this has been done by Dario Vicente in his PhD, to then basically from a short time series, generate a transition matrix, and then resample to estimate rare events. And one other thing which is interesting for relevant simulation methods is that from this transition matrix, so here it is the infinitesimal generator Q, the transition matrix is Q dagger. You can estimate the probability to reach state A before state B, starting from any position X, so what is called the commutator function, because this probability is the solution of the backward Fokker-Planck equation with some specific boundary conditions. So here, using the fact that it's actually an eigenvalue problem, so you solve this eigenvalue problem from the sample transition matrix, and then you obtain this probability Q. And then you can reuse it in relevant simulation methods. Why is that? Because Q is actually the optimal score function for MS. So what you can do is do a DNS, sample 2-3 events, and actually you obtain a precise enough estimate of Q, and then this precise enough estimate of Q, you use it for MS, and you can see by looking at the bias and the bias on the estimates of the mean first passage time, is that it actually gives you the best results possible for the use of the relevant simulation method. So that's explained here. And as a last example, I will talk about the sampling of the construction of stochastic processes. So again, from some time series where you have a few switches, you would like to construct a stochastic process for maybe a handful of features. And what would be interesting actually also is that F and A are basically simple functions that we can read as people. So not like a neural network. So like, I don't know, combinations of polynomials or exponentials or logs, etc. So first step is that, well, you first need to check from your data that you have the Markov property. So basically it's relevant to represent it with a stochastic process. And what you will do actually to generate this stochastic differential equation is actually instead generate the corresponding Fokker-Planck equations. So basically from the data, you're going to estimate the empirical Kramers-Moyal coefficients. And basically you're going to then fit the optimal F and A in terms of basically better matching the finite time Kramers-Moyal coefficients, better matching the PDF of X, and also having the simplest form so that you can adjust this process and basically having some simple formulas with database coefficients that gives you these coefficients. And then you can analyze the drift and diffusions, and you can resample it. So for instance, from this 1D case for the tilted jet, you have the, let's say, the finite time Kramers-Moyal coefficients here in black dots. And then you generate the coefficients in blue of the of this stochastic process. And actually, you end up having with a rather simple formula. And you use it to resample the switches. So here we compare it to a very long experiments. So where we have a lot of example of switches, but actually this can be generated from a rather short data set. So you can see that you have some error of order 25% the relative error. So it doesn't look too good in linear scale when you look at the mean first passage time. But if you follow the exponential growth of t, if you keep this kind of relative error, it's actually a rather acceptable error when you look at large deviations and exponential increases. And with that, also it's based on a procedure which has been proposed by Karam, Loiseau, and Brunton, and to which we have made a certain number of modifications. And to this, I will conclude. So that's first say that relevant simulation methods can be used to quite drastically accelerate the computation of bistable trajectories in turbulent flows. So for the plate flow problem, I said that I have an acceleration of a factor of 10,000. That's because for the rarest event I've looked at, there was a ratio of 10,000 between the cost of IMS and DNS. But if I had looked at even a rarer event, I would have had even larger acceleration factor. So from this larger number of trajectories estimated with smaller biases and lower cost, I can then study the mechanism of the switching scenarios, have more precise estimate of the mean first passage time to study its parametric dependence on like Reynolds number, system size, and all these things. So it's very interesting. And from this empirical model construction, I can construct, it's possible to construct, let's say, Markov chain that can be used then to help the relevant simulation methods, or readable stochastic processes that can be used then to resample time series, or to have simple formulas for the coefficients from which, and then follow the behavior of the coefficient when you vary the parameters. So it's really helpful for the study of bistability. So then as perspective, well, I plan to use again these systematic model constructions for the tilted jet problem to study basically all the bifurcation scenarios that when you change the parameter for this specific problem in the experimental facility, and also use the relevant simulation methods to look further into the bistability of laminar and turbulent flow in plate flow. And among other things, what happens when you put some forcing to plate flow when it goes toward turbulence? What happens? And I'm looking into these things. And with this, I will thank you for your attention. I hope I am in time. And if you have some questions.
Yeah, so we were on time. Yes.
2 questions.
2 questions. Let's.
But you have a question first.
Who is the first? Yes, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Thanks. So you had this signal xt, and you're constructing this Markov chain with Q. I was wondering how you are discretizing the xt space, which seems to be continuous?
So basically here you have to take a finite number of samples, maybe, and you have a finite time step between them. So you have this constraint of basically having a finite time. Yeah. So it's discretized in time, and of course, if you take dt way too large, you're going to miss the detail of the transition from one x to the next. So
I was wondering about discretization in space.
no.
Are you subsampling your?
No. That actually, from what I basically have, since this picture is in the tilting jet problem. So what I do is that I select some features. So from the full velocity field here, from this basically here it's the kinetic energy obtained in a plane. From this, I extract a handful of time series. So for instance, the simplest thing that I can do is to measure the average y position of the jet by weighting by kinetic energy. So what I don't discretize in space. I generate several time series.
Are your features continuous?
So
Are they discrete features so that you can number them 1, 2, 3?
No, it's discrete. For instance, I can have what you can also do is apply PCA and use the amplitude of the leading PCA modes, and you can have maybe 2, 3 PCA coefficients, and so it's discrete.
But the PCA amplitudes actually can be continuous, right? You can have any real numbers. So
no. I don't know. You mean that whether I have these kind of jumps? If I have time, where I have something like this or something like that. What you were asking.
Theoretically, values could be continuous. Obviously, your observations.
You're asking whether. So for the Markov chain, I have a finite number of states. So the Markov matrix has a finite size. So basically, I have a finite number of states, which are the basically the maybe if I have maybe 1,000 time samples, I will have 1,000 states. So it's discretized in this sense.
All right, let's continue this. Thank you.
Yes. Valerio.
Yes. Can you explain the difference in the procedure in the case you consider a deterministic two-point flow and the stochastic?
So for the stochastic case, you always have the noise forcing.
Yes.
And basically, when you do two realizations, where you just change a seed in the noise, and then you're going to have an independent realization. So for deterministic, if you branch and you take the same state, well, you're going to have exactly the same behavior. So first thing you need to do is adding a small perturbation, and with some constraints so that you can continuously reconstruct the trajectories. Some people, they also put permanent background noise, but of small amplitude. And one other difficult thing that you can have with a turbulent flow, deterministic turbulent flow, is that sometimes trajectories take too long to separate. So you branch, you put a small perturbation, the trajectory will not separate. So one thing that you can do sometimes is that you branch backward in time, and then you make sure that that new branch trajectory will go further than you expect.
Yes, thanks. No, but my comment is on the fact that if you have a stochastic system with noise, you have actual method stability. So you have, in the limit of noise to zero, you have two competing states, and you get Cramer's formula and everything. If it's deterministic, it's a bit different, isn't it?
Yeah, it's different.
Time scale separation argument. So how do you justify it? It works, but I never really understood the why.
So this here it's only stochastic systems. Yes. So basically you have actual bistability. Yes. Here it's deterministic. So basically, strictly speaking, when you're here, probability to go to laminar eventually is 1.
Yes. So
it's not exactly bistability in a stochastic sense. Yes. So but you still have let's say mean waiting time of before going toward laminar states, which will grow very rapidly. And if you sample waiting times, they are still going to be distributed along. So you have this distinction.
Okay, thank you.
The point, yeah.
I think there's the time.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
You had this interesting feedback thingy where you start with AMS to sample reactive trajectories, and you use that to construct the model, and then use the committer that comes out of the model in order to feed back to AMS. Yeah. But the model is always a reduction. So what you obtain is the transition probability only for the reduced model. How do you use that then to get the Q or the transition?
Well, basically, when you're going to construct this file here, you are also going to do a reduction. So you need to take the same reduction here at there. So basically, what you do is for file, you select a number of features. So for instance, I don't know, for the jet problem, we select Fourier modes, and the naive way would be to do some linear combinations of the Fourier modes.
No, but I'm saying, I think in your analog Markov chain, you have the transition probability for every state that you've seen in the past. Yeah. But now your AMS generates a completely new state.
So what you basically use the nearest neighbor thing. So basically what you do is that, so you have a state and you compute is maybe 10 nearest neighbors, and you have a weighted average of the Q of the 10 nearest neighbors.
So just interpolate. That's the
yeah. You interpolate. Yeah.
Okay, so
just
very quick. Very quick.
Yeah, just following up on the development by Toby just now. That means that suppose you have multiple different reaction channels. That's a typical path. But you have to be sure that you capture all of those in the data that you have to construct the Markov chain.
Yes, so that's one way to, because that's a big risk with AMS, is that if you construct the file poorly, you will miss some transition channel. And with the advantage, that's the way you save, is that if you make these mistakes, and then when you repeat the use of AMS several times, this will leave a trace in the statistics of for instance, the waiting time that you've sampled. So if you have a problem, then you will see that the statistics of T that you sampled with several repeated use of AMS are going to be wrong, and then you're going to say, actually, I'm making a mistake because I'm missing a channel or something like this. So you don't see it directly, but if you repeat it, you see that AMS is not working comfortably because you have missed some transition channels.
So that Markov chain then can't help you to discover new reaction channels.
Well, the Markov chain well, you need to sample these several transition channels for the Markov chain to be precise. So in this article with Lipschitz, we consider a case where you have several transition channels, and what happens if you have sampled only one transition through one channel, or maybe at least two transitions going through the two channels, and how this impact the Markov chain.
Okay, thank you. I think we should move on. Thank you very much, Joran.